last year there was an arrest in Toronto of a large number of young Muslims who were plotting to blow up the Canadian Parliament building, a number of other Canadian cultural landmarks, and some other key places. And they were all young Muslim males. And the Toronto Globe and Mail, the leading newspaper in Canada, published an article saying the police are puzzled as to what on earth could unify this diverse group of people who are of different ages, who are of different professions, who all come from different countries, and some of them are native Canadians. And they can't figure out what on earth could have brought them together. Now, we're laughing, but I say this in all seriousness. This is an absolutely true article. This is something that you can find if you look on the internet. There is, of course, nothing really surprising about it. Because the one thing that marginalizes us, the one thing that makes everybody in this room an extreme far-right, Islamophobic, racist bigot, is that we say that there's something about Islam that is responsible for this problem.
Hear, hear.
And that's the one thing that cannot be admitted, is not admitted, and may never be admitted by the elite class, by the mainstream media in Europe and in America, by the politicians. And yet, as we saw from Dr. Solomon, as we saw all through the day, nothing could be more obvious. Islam, from its inception, has been not just a religion in the Western sense, and certainly not a religion that accepts the sacred secular distinction that at least for the last several hundred years has defined the European and the American governmental and societal systems. It is much more than that. From its inception, it has been a political and social system. I travel all around the United States all the time, and I ask people, you all may know that this is the year 1428. What is it 1428 years after? What is the, in other words, what is the beginning of the Islamic calendar? And people answer, well, it's obviously, must be when Muhammad was born. It must be when Muhammad died. It must be when Muhammad became a prophet. And of course, none of those are the right answer. As you all no doubt know, the year 1 of the Islamic calendar is the year of the Hijrah, the flight when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina. Now, what on earth could be so significant about his moving from one city to another that it has been, by means of the Islamic calendar, by means of this most mainstream element of traditional Islam, anointed as the actual beginning of Islam itself, such that everything in Islam is dated from this? What on earth is so important about it? In Medina, of course, Muhammad became for the first time not just a preacher of religious ideas, but a political and military commander. Islam for the first time became a polity, a state. And thus it is essential to and inherent within the traditional Islamic understanding of what it is that it be a state, that it govern, and that that state is not pluralistic and not democratic. Islam, said Muhammad, must dominate and not be dominated. He told his followers that when you meet the unbelievers, first you invite them to accept Islam. How seriously do Muslims take that today? What did Osama bin Laden do in his last videotape? He invited Americans to accept Islam. What did Mahmoud Ahmadinejad do in his letter to President Bush last year? He invited us to accept Islam. That is very clearly something they are doing because they are pious Muslims. They are believers in Muhammad's word that this is what you do when you meet the unbelievers. So what comes next? He said, if they accept it, do not fight them, hold off your hands. But if they refuse, then ask them to pay the jizya. And of course the jizya is the tax, it just means tax in Arabic. Chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran says that Muslims must fight even against the people of the book, which is the Quranic designation primarily for Jews and Christians, fight even against the people of the book until they pay the jizya, this tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Which became, as I'm sure you're all aware, I won't dwell too long on these points, but it became the linchpin of an elaborate social superstructure of institutionalized discrimination, which mandated that the non-Muslims under the rule of the Islamic State would know, as Dr. Solomon was explaining, they would be reminded at every moment that they were renegades, that they were evil because they had rejected Muhammad. That there would be enmity and hatred, as the Quran says, between the believers and the unbelievers because the unbelievers were so obstinate as to reject Muhammad. There's a story in Islamic tradition of a delegation of Christians who came from Najran in Yemen to visit Muhammad. And it says that as they were traveling, the leader of them explained to the others, now we know this man is a prophet of God. We know this man is a prophet of God. But we get money from the Byzantines on a regular basis. The Byzantines support us. If they find out that we believe this man is a prophet of God, they will cut us off. Therefore, we're going to go and dispute with him, and we must not accept anything he says. And it is part of the core traditional Islamic understanding of the non-Muslim that he is in bad faith. That he knows Muhammad is a prophet, that he knows Islam is true, but he won't admit it because it would be too inconvenient for him. He would suffer various material disadvantages, and so he won't do it. And I see this all the time. You know, I get about 8 or 10 emails from Muslims every day. And they constantly assume that I know better, that I'm lying, that I'm in bad faith, that I must know Islam is true and Muhammad is a prophet, especially because they can see that I've read and studied the Quran and the Sunnah. I must be evil. See? So, understand though, that is not simply me, that's all of you. And most importantly, that is all of the states that are not governed according to Islamic law, that have not accepted the truth of Islam. And so how can they possibly make an accord to live in lasting peace when Islam must dominate and not be dominated, when the unbelievers are the worst creatures on earth? Chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran, we saw it earlier. In chapter 3, verse 110, says the Muslims are the best people on earth. So you have the best of people and the worst of people, the most vile creatures. Muslims are to fight until religion is for Allah. Muhammad said, I've been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. But the commentators are more generous. They say, well, at very least, the non-Muslims need not accept that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, but at very least they must accept the rule of the Islamic State as the law of God, and accept their submission, their subjugation within it as inferiors because of their rejection, to remind them of their guilt. So to religious and a political ideology, these things are not separable from one another. These things are inherent within it. Now, what causes the problem? Is Islam itself the problem? Obviously, that would suggest that it is, because when you read the writings of the jihadists, and when you listen to what they say, constantly they invoke these things. You read the statements of Osama bin Laden, and you see again and again, he's quoting Quran again and again. And again, I have asked on my website, Jihad Watch, I've asked people, asked Muslims, look, here is Osama bin Laden. These are the verses of the Quran that he's quoting. Please explain how he's misusing them and twisting and hijacking them. And of course, there's never an answer. There can't be an answer because he isn't. But the core of his appeal is Islamic purity. The core of the jihadist appeal all around the world is Islamic purity. They are the Salaf, the true Muslims, the pure Muslims, the pure ones. And so they are calling the Muslims who have allowed themselves to forget this, And they explain, this is real Islam, this is the true Islam, this is what the Quran says, this is what Muhammad says, this is what the schools of jurisprudence say, this is your responsibility as a Muslim. And you've forgotten it. One of the most widely circulated pamphlets in the Islamic world over the last 40 years is called Jihad, the Forgotten Obligation. But you see, this has the power to cloud men's minds. Because people think, well, since we didn't see this 50 years ago, at least in the scale that we see it today, we didn't see this 75 years ago, we didn't see this 100 years ago, we did, but we weren't really paying attention to the degree we are now. And it wasn't really going on to the degree it is now. People think it's something newly minted, it's a heresy within Islam, and the great majority of the decent Muslim folk abhor it and will have nothing to do with it. But it's not the case. I'm not saying that they are all actively working on it. There's a spectrum of belief, of knowledge, of fervor within Islam as there is within any other belief system, whether it's religious or not. In other words, there are people who bear the name, but they don't necessarily know anything about it or do anything about it. And there are people who call themselves Muslims who are much more interested in getting rich and living a comfortable life. There are people who call themselves Christians and Jews and Hindus and Buddhists who couldn't care less about the religion, but they're more interested in other things. But always, the appeal is to Islamic purity. But nonetheless, this is the main problem. This is why we are having such a hard time getting our message across. Because the mainstream will tell you, the analysts, the learned analysts will tell you, the government experts will tell you, that if you talk about Islam as the problem, then therefore you are condemning all Muslims and saying we have to go to war with 1.3 billion or 1.5 billion or 1.7 billion or 2.6 billion or 10 billion people. There's an American news feature program, Hannity and Colmes, you may be familiar with. It's kind of a circus, really. Hannity is the conservative and Colmes is the liberal. And they're really just the same. But the other night, Colmes was with Stephen Emerson, the great expert on terrorist activity, Islamic terrorist activity. And he was saying, you're talking about Islamofascism, and this is offensive, this is racist. You are condemning the entire religion. And Emerson was wonderful. Emerson said, so what would you call them, Alan Colmes? What would you say? Well, I would say fascists. And he said, okay, well then how do you distinguish them from Italian fascists or German fascists or Portuguese fascists or any other? And he said, well, I don't know, but we just can't say Islamic. We can't say anything to do with Islamic because that condemns the entire religion. And Emerson said, well, you know, there are terrorist groups with names like Islamic Jihad. So you say we can't use these names that they use for themselves, and that was the heart of the problem. That while it's taken for granted around the world. The European Union, as you well know, as you know far better than I do, has these seminars about Islamophobia, and the United Nations has these seminars and hand-wringing about what can we do about this rising phenomenon of Islamophobia. Well, obviously, it's very easy. Stop blowing things up. But the point is that there would never be Islamophobia. Nobody would ever have made the equation between Islam and terrorism, and Islam and supremacism, and the subjugation, the destruction of Western pluralism if the Muslims themselves hadn't made the equation. It isn't we who are responsible. But when Alan Colmes and all the many others like him, and Hannity also, who went in and said the same things a little bit later on the same program, when both the left and the right, when everyone in the mainstream acts as if, and the United Nations and the European Union with their seminars, what they're doing is acting as if it is we who made this up. There were some terrorists and they happened to be Muslim, but the Islam had nothing to do with what they were doing. And we, out of our bigotry and our racism and our hatred, we put together the idea of Islamic terrorism. And, you know, it's self-evidently absurd. It comes from them. It comes from people like the Saudi Arabian embassy in Washington, D.C., which 2 years after 9/11, 2 years after 9/11, the United States friend and ally, Saudi Arabia, had on its website in Washington, D.C., the embassy, this statement: the Muslims are required to raise the banner of jihad in order to make the word of Allah supreme in this world. Now, did I write that? Did you write that? The Saudis wrote that. It was there, right there on their website. So it isn't we who made the equation. These people are following out a very clear playbook that they have made abundantly clear as to their intentions, as to their motives, as to their goals. They have not made any secret about it whatsoever. And here we are, and we know it's a basic principle of warfare. You cannot defeat an enemy unless you understand what he's trying to do and how he intends to do it. When we read their book, when we try to understand their motives and their goals, then it becomes our fault. Then it becomes our own bigotry and racism and hatred. So paradoxically, when Islamic jihadists use the Quran and the Sunnah to justify what they're doing and to make recruits among peaceful Muslims, we don't hear a peep out of the Muslim advocacy groups in Europe or the United States. Did you see anybody protest? Osama bin Laden just sent a letter to the people of Pakistan in which he called upon them to rise up in jihad warfare against the Musharraf regime. And he quoted 10 verses of the Quran, and he explained them, and he invoked the example of Muhammad. And he made an Islamic case for the lack of legitimacy of the Musharraf regime. Did you hear any Western groups protesting that? Did you hear any Islamic group in Europe or the United States explain, well, Osama bin Laden is misusing the Quran, he's misusing Islamic tradition, these things are all wrong? No, you didn't. And if anybody were to go and ask a Muslim leader in Brussels tonight, why didn't you say anything about that? He would say, oh, we say things all the time about this, but the press doesn't cover it. Right? Have you heard this? This is the most brazen lie of all, perhaps, because the press thirsts for nothing more than the moderate Muslim. The press is avid to find any Muslim who's not blowing us up, and they will feature him on the front page of every newspaper and in every news show there is. And of course, our government officials, all of our government officials from all the states from which we come, believe that if there is a Muslim not actively engaged in blowing us up at this moment, there's a moderate. But paradoxically, when the jihadists use all this material, invoke these traditional Islamic categories, there's nothing. But when non-Muslims quote them, then there are cries to outlaw blasphemy. And there are cries to protect the Muslims from this kind of vilification. And there are cries of hatred and bigotry and ignorance. But, okay, I will confess, I'm ignorant. I'm ignorant of a great many things, and one thing that I'm mainly ignorant of is, where is this peaceful Islam? I don't mean peaceful Muslims, I said peaceful Islam. There are peaceful Muslims, but where is the theoretical, theological, Islamo-legal construct that does not mandate the dominance of and the subjugation of unbelievers? It doesn't exist. So why don't they show us? Where is it? But it never exists. It's the great unicorn that no one has ever seen, and yet everyone takes for granted its existence. The great vulnerability of these peaceful cultural Muslims who are just going about their business and living their lives and working their jobs is that they don't have an Islamic response to the Salafi appeal, to the appeal from the jihadists saying, we are the pure Muslims, this is real Islam. If they want to be serious about their religion, that's how to do it. And there isn't any other way that has been set out by anyone. So, what is the purpose of all this? What is going on that it would be virtually impossible to say anything about the true nature of what we are facing in the media, in Europe, or in the United States? And And what is it that makes it such that we are out here on the fringes, on the far right? Just because we acknowledge that there is something about Islam. Obviously, I think we have to be frank. The non-Muslim forces that are pushing this idea and that are forbidding any discussion of the elements of Islam that the jihadists, the Muslims themselves, are using to justify violence and to spread supremacist ideas. They've made a conscious decision that they don't want this perspective to be heard, and they are pursuing various political and financial advantages that they think will come from accommodating the Islamic world in this. I mean, what could be more obvious from all that we've seen and heard today? I'm not saying there's a great conspiracy. I'm not saying that anybody has necessarily made any kind of conscious deliberation about this, although maybe they have. But nonetheless, the effect is the same. Whether from short-sighted self-interest or from knowledge and malice aforethought, they don't want the Islamic advance to be stopped. They don't want the Islamization of Europe to be stopped. And they are in power. I ask you if that's not reasonable. We can talk later, you can tell me that's completely absurd. Of course they very much want it all to be stopped. I don't see it. These people they're not idiots. Well, maybe some of them are. When George W. Bush constantly quotes chapter 5, verse 32 of the Quran, that if anybody slays an innocent person, it's as if he has killed the whole world. And he never quotes 533. I'm sure he's never seen 533. That if you make war against Allah and His Messenger, then the punishment is crucifixion or the amputation of the hands and feet on opposite sides. But how terribly irresponsible, who was it exactly who gave him 532 without 533? Who knew where to find it? He must have known what followed it. He must have known what's in the rest of the book. He must have known that all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence, all of them that are considered orthodox in the Islamic world, consider it part of the responsibility of the Ummah, the community worldwide, to subjugate the unbelievers. By war, if necessary, but if not, so much the better. But as long as they are subjugated under the rule of Islamic law. Maududi, the great Islamist in Pakistan, he said, non-believers have absolutely no right to wield the reins of power in any part of God's earth. And if they do, the believers are under the obligation to dislodge them from that power by any means possible. And that is the program that they are pursuing. So, what is it that keeps somebody like George Bush or Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or all the rest of them from recognizing that and acknowledging it? They see some self-interest in the status quo. They see something worth preserving in the established order, and we can't make our voice heard. There's not a free press in Europe. There's not hardly a free press in the United States. So, from the Muslim side, it's all part of the jihad imperative. Sam talked about deception. It's rooted in the Quran. Chapter 3, verse 28 says that if a believer is not to take an unbeliever as friend and protector, unless he is doing it to guard himself against the unbeliever. Do not take the unbelievers as friends and protectors unless you are doing it to guard yourselves against them. Now what does that mean? Unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them is a strange phrase. It could be ambiguous. So go to the commentators. Go to what the Muslims say about it. Go to Ibn Kathir, who is a titanic, a mainstream commentator on the Quran from the 15th century. His writings are still read today, published in a handsome edition by the Saudis. And he says, the deception is allowed when the Muslims are vulnerable, when the Muslims are weak. They can deceive the unbelievers, they can pretend to be their friends. And he quoted a hadith, a tradition that said, we smile in the faces of some people, but behind their backs we curse them. Now this smiling and cursing, or at least the smiling part, is the official mainstream orthodoxy. Islam is a religion of peace. Islam is tolerant. We are citizens of Belgium, the Netherlands, Britain, the United States. The campaign recently started, you know, have you seen it? The Islam is Peace campaign in the UK. Buses and other public transportation, they have these large banners. Islam is peace, proud to be a British Muslim. And television spots with all these handsome, smiling people saying, I am a British Muslim. And Islam is peace. We are starting a campaign. And what's the first? There's a 5-point program that the Islam is Peace campaign has. Now let me ask you this. What if you were a peaceful Muslim who really did abhor the idea of Islamic supremacism and the subjugation of unbelievers, and you really did want to live in peace as equals on an indefinite basis with the Muslims? And so you thought, I have a little money, I'll start a campaign. Islam is peace. What would be step 1? 5-point program. Point 1, I'll tell you if I were doing it. Point 1 would be challenge the Muslims who are committing violence in the name of Islam. And stand up to them. And tell them that what they're doing is wrong. And if you can't find an Islamic basis to tell them what they're doing is wrong, tell them on the basis of the natural human conscience. But the first step, the first point of the Islam is Peace campaign in Britain is to combat Islamophobia. It's our fault again. We're the ones connecting Islam with terrorism. So, we need in the first place to continue to remind our countrymen, to continue to remind everyone we possibly can, that we stand for certain values, for a certain order, for a certain civilization that is the greatest and that is superior without apology. Nobody had any hesitation. Well, actually a lot of people did, but there were many people who had no hesitation about saying during the Cold War that the Western way of life was superior to the Soviet communist model. And this is because, of course, well, Islam is a religion of peace, and it's in the worst possible taste to ask a Muslim who's coming to apply for a job, well, what do you feel about all this? Where do you stand in terms of Islamic supremacism? Nobody even knows the right questions to ask. So, we stand for a greater civilization. Because it's religious, we can't say this now the way we could say it to the communists, even those who were willing to say it then. Because it's a religious civilization, it's considered to be out of the bounds of reasonable discourse to say that something could be greater. It's bigotry here again. But we've seen this all day. We stand for, because of the dignity of the human person, which comes out of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea of human beings made in the image of God, because of the inherent God-given dignity of the human person, which is something that the West takes for granted now, and that the rest of the world takes for granted now. Regardless of whether you're a believer at this point or not, that's not important. At least not important in this context. I think that there is an appeal that can be and should be made by us to our countrymen who are lost in this fog of deception that is being spread by the elites. If we say we stand for these superior values, the freedom of conscience, the equality of dignity of women with men, the equality of rights of all people, instead of an institutionalized discrimination based on creed or anything else. And we stand for these things as coming particularly from Western civilization. Somebody, I don't remember who, and I apologize, somebody earlier made reference to, oh, I believe it was you, Doctor, but I'm not sure, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN. Yes, it was. And there was, oh, that's right, it was the Iranian spokesman who said, this document, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is a manifestation of Judeo-Christian values, and we reject them as Muslims. And of course they certified that rejection with the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. That here, like the Afghan Constitution, again, subjected all laws to the rule of Sharia. Anything else, it's only insofar as Sharia gives it boundaries. So, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for all its flaws, and I do disagree with the proposition that these rights are granted by the state. I think that's a dangerous notion that can lead to state control such that might not be positive. Nonetheless, it's extremely significant that the values that were enshrined within the document and certified and agreed to by the whole world, with the exception of the Islamic world, that they come from Western principles. They come from Western civilization. And this is something that we should have the courage and the awareness to appeal even to Muslims on this basis and say this is a greater model, a better model for society than what you are offering.